You wake to the sound of controlled force against wood 3 knocks, then 2 knot the signal you were trained to recognize, and not a mistake either. Your eyes open into a room held at a constant 19 degrees Celsius. The refrigerator humming in a predictable cycle that you've memorized without trying. Your breathing measured at 4 seconds in and 4 seconds out. Your face already neutral before you fully sit up, because reaction is exposure and exposure is failure. The burner phone beside you is dark, no vibration, no missed call, no coded message, which means the system didn't warn you, which means whatever is happening is already inside the margins of error you were told never to assume existed, and you stand slowly, feet against cold tile, counting distance without looking, 6.5 steps to the door, 3 to the sink, 2 to the blind spot near the window while the knock repeats, softer now, probing, testing, and you don't answer, because answering is a commitment, and you wait through 30 seconds of silence until the presence shifts and retreats, footsteps fading just enough to confirm delay, not safety, and you remain still because stillness is the only control you have left. It didn't start like this. It started in a building with no name, fluorescent lights fixed at 6,000 K, air held at 21 degrees, where you sat for 9 hours answering the same questions in slightly altered forms, not to prove intelligence, but consistency, because consistency can be modeled, predicted, weaponized, and by day 3, they stopped asking about who you were and began instructing you on who you would be, handing you a life assembled from records that stretched back 7 years, tax filings, utility bills, academic transcripts, all verifiable, all false, and your original name was not erased but made irrelevant, replaced through repetition rather than deletion, until the new one responded faster in your mind than the old ever did. Training followed a schedule that removed interpretation. Wake at 5:30, lights on at 5:31, 90 seconds to stand, not 91, because deviation, even at the level of a second, is a variable, and variables are what get people identified, and you learn to observe before you learn to act, sitting behind glass watching people who didn't know they were being studied, cataloging blink rates, hand movements, pauses in speech measured in fractions of seconds, until behavior became data and data became instinct, and you were taught to construct memory the same way, layering sensory detail onto events that never happened until they stabilized under questioning, until you could describe the smell of a kitchen you never entered with enough precision to convince someone who had. And after 6 months, the distinction between real and constructed memory stopped being useful, so it disappeared. Your first year in the field was cautious. Every movement rehearsed, every exit checked twice, conversations running in your head before they left your mouth, your handler meeting you every 14 days for exactly 7 minutes in locations that never repeated, no names exchanged, only codes, information passed in fragments so that no single failure could collapse the structure, and you learned the network not by hierarchy but by pattern, who arrived first, who spoke last, who never stayed beyond 2,200 hours, and you adjusted your behavior to sit within statistical averages because being exceptional is detectable and being absent is suspicious. So you existed in the narrow space between, where nothing stands out long enough to be remembered. By year 2, the adjustments became automatic, responses immediate, tone and posture aligned with the environment without conscious effort, and your handler reduced contact to 30 days, then 45, then only when required, because your reliability had been quantified 712 consecutive days without deviation and trust, in this system was nothing more than a sustained absence of error. The rules you followed were never written, but they were absolute, never ask direct questions, only guide conversations toward disclosure, never initiate action, only support it, never accumulate attention, remain within one standard deviation of expected behavior, and you tracked yourself constantly, average public exposure at 3.2 hours per day, average interactions at 11, adjusting speech length, eye contact, and movement patterns to stay centered, because the middle is where systems stop looking. Money moved through your hands in increasing increments, 2,000, 5,000, 20,000, always cash, always partial, and you learn to estimate value by weight and thickness without looking, because counting is visible and visibility is risk, and when someone miscalculated once, 1,800 missing, there was no confrontation, no correction, only absence the next day, and no one asked. Because questions create records, and records create chains. By year 3, your body mapped rooms before your mind registered them, identifying exits, choke points, and irregularities within 2 seconds of entry, and you stop noticing the process itself, which is how erosion begins not as loss, but as automation, while your previous life degraded quietly. Memories incomplete, locations blurred, voices without clarity, until you stop testing them, because they served no operational purpose, and relationships became structured interactions. One maintained connection twice a week for 90 minutes in a fixed location, conversation controlled, disclosure limited, attachment simulated with enough accuracy that even you experienced it intermittently, though you never allowed it to alter behavior. Year 4 introduced instability, small inconsistencies that accumulated, meetings rescheduled without reason, conversations shortened, 2 arrests within 10 days executed with precision that suggested internal leakage and no one announced it, because systems like this communicate through deviation, not instruction, and you adjusted, speaking less, listening more, noting that questions began to repeat, once casually, then again with slight variation, testing for divergence, and you responded identically each time, because consistency under repetition is what separates integration from exposure. Your handler went silent for 72 hours after your last signal, and that was the first moment you calculated the probability that you were operating without support, that you were no longer an insertion point but an internal component, and when the instruction finally came, it was direct and uncharacteristic, a new location, an unfamiliar room, a man you recognized but did not know, handing you a weapon without explanation before providing a name and a task, and when you saw the face, you recognized it immediately as internal, one of yours, not publicly compromised, not formally identified, but aligned through pattern recognition that required no confirmation, and you understood that this was not a mission but a measurement, a controlled test of alignment under pressure where hesitation would be recorded and refusal would be terminal, preparation followed procedure exactly, arrival within a 2-minute window, entry through the designated path, no deviation, the target alone as expected, and when he saw you, the recognition passed without words, an understanding that existed entirely in shared context, and you raised the weapon with steady hands, breathing controlled, 4 seconds in and out, and you executed the action without delay because delay would be the only visible error, confirming outcome in 3 seconds before exiting along the planned route, leaving no variation for analysis. Afterward, the system stabilized, meetings resumed, communication normalized, and your position solidified without acknowledgement, your handler reappearing after 11 days with new instructions and no reference to what had occurred, because events are only relevant if they introduce variance, and you had not. And that was when you understood fully that you were no longer inside the system but part of its maintenance, an internal mechanism designed to correct imbalance without being recognized as such. Years extended beyond 5, then 6, performance sustained without deviation, and the shift that occurred was not external but internal, a gradual absence where identity had once been, and when you attempted to reconstruct your original self, the data did not align, fragments without sequence, a name that no longer resolved to a stable reference, and the realization arrived without intensity, just a quiet confirmation that there was no external version of you remaining, only the function you performed. Exit came as another instruction, return, the facility unchanged, the same lighting, the same temperature, the same absence of acknowledgement, and you were processed as if new, your reports delivered in full detail, every action documented, every decision accounted for, received without reaction, because recognition is not part of the system, only evaluation, and at the end, you were issued a new identity designated as non-operational, a reassignment that removed you from the active structure without ceremony, without closure, because closure implies finality and the system does not recognize final states. The new life lacked constraints, irregular sleep, unstructured movement, uncontrolled conversation, and it felt incorrect, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it lacked parameters. And without parameters, there was no metric for correctness, weeks passing into months as you attempted to simulate normalcy without a framework to measure it against, until one day a knock came at your door, 3, then 2, and your body responded before thought, breathing, stabilizing, posture aligning, every trained instinct reactivating instantly, and you remained still, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because the pattern had returned, not necessarily for you, but as part of a cycle that continues independent of individual roles. And you understood then that the system does not end. It rotates, it replaces, it sustains itself through continuity of function rather than continuity of people. And somewhere, in a room with controlled light and temperature, someone is answering questions, repeating constructed memories, allowing their original identity to degrade in favor of a more stable fabrication, just as you did, and the knock comes again. 3, then 2, and you do not move because you no longer know whether you are being tested, retrieved, or replaced, only that the pattern is intact and the system, as always, continues without interruption.